Splendid show for you today. I am joined by Niall Stanich. Niall, it's been a while.
It has been a while. I'm glad we are reunited, Robby, for one day's entertainment. Should be good.
So am I. What a treat.
How have you been?
I have been quite well, actually. How have you been?
I have been likewise very well, but I want to hear more about what is on your radar, so take it away.
Yes, lots of subjects to get to today that you and I enjoyed discussing, I think. Iran being a very big one. Now, one of the criticisms of alternative media I have heard over the years is that podcasters, social media personalities, and influencers who describe themselves as independent-minded often fail to ask tough questions of their guests or push back when greater scrutiny is warranted. Joe Rogan is frequently cited as an example of this. He platforms provocative guests like Daryl Cooper and Ian Carroll, and because the format is friendly and informal, he fails to press them when they make dubious or outrageous claims. That was the thrust of the criticism made by British journalist Douglas Murray, who used his own appearance on Rogan as an opportunity to attack the host's failure to properly interrogate people that Murray considers to be, well, conspiracy theorists. Now, by contrast, mainstream media is characterized by hostile interviews. For example, see every single instance of CNN, CBS, or ABC interviewing a Republican political figure, though, to be fair, interviews with Democrats are often contentious as well. Politicians don't really want to be asked tough questions, but journalism is supposed to be adversarial, and the public is best served by interview formats that provoke discomfort. Now, if the traditional mainstream format is entirely replaced by podcasts where people get to say whatever they want and face no pushback whatsoever, it should be obvious that, one, this would be worse for the country, and two, politicians would absolutely prefer it. But here's the thing. The current debate over whether the U.S. military should become more involved in Israel's war against Iran is a powerful counterexample and showcases the unique ability of the podcast universe to, in some important cases, cut through the mainstream media's reflexive deference to hawkish national security experts and get to the root of fundamental questions. Do the American people really want another regime change war in the Middle East? Now, this dynamic was well illustrated by Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Senator Ted Cruz on X. The pair of conservative giants engaged in a 2-hour exchange on the subject of Iran. It was feisty and intermittently unpleasant, for them at least. It was madly entertaining for viewers, and gave Carlson ample opportunity to expose the hollowness of Cruz's position, which seemed to be that regime change in Iran would somehow work out better than regime change in Iraq, or Libya, or Syria. We played some of that interview yesterday, and subsequently I watched the whole thing, and it's really, really good content. I can't recommend it more. Here's another exchange.
Asking you answer it. Give me another reason. If you're not an anti-Semite, give me another reason why the obsession is Israel.
I am in no sense obsessed with Israel. We are on the brink of war with Iran, and so these are valid questions.
But you're not asking about Iran or the
If I can finish. You asked me why I'm obsessed with Israel.
Yep.
3 minutes after telling me that when you first ran for Congress, you elucidated one of your main goals, which is to defend Israel.
Yes.
And I'm the one who's obsessed with Israel.
Yeah, that brief exchange really doesn't do it justice. What happened was that Cruz accused Carlson and other critics of the war effort of being obsessed with Israel, and even insinuating this was due to some vague anti-Semitic undercurrent. This accusation was remarkable because just moments earlier, as Carlson pointed out there, Cruz had admitted his own reason for running for office was to be the most pro-Israel U.S. senator in history. And then moments later, he confessed his unwavering support for Israel was due to a biblical passage that emphasizes those who side with Israel will be blessed. In response, Carlson sardonically mused on whether the Bible's authors had a specific Israeli government in mind. Look, it's not anti-Jewish or anti-Israel for the U.S. to think very carefully about whether supporting and aiding military strikes against Iran is in the best interest of Americans. Israel uses American weapons to launch its attacks, and it relies on American technology to protect its own citizens from Iranian counterattack. Israel does have the right to defend itself against attacks from hostile foreign powers and terrorists. It does not have the right to single-mindedly drag the U.S. into yet another boondoggle in the Middle East, particularly without congressional authorization. Now, Carlson, a Fox News host turned independent media giant, is actually hardly alone among podcasters in evincing skepticism about doing Israel's bidding in the Middle East. Joe Rogan is perturbed. Theo Vaughn has expressed horror over Israel's campaign in Gaza. Dave Smith says he regrets voting for Trump. He even thinks Trump should be impeached for breaking his promise not to start new wars. Those are just the plausibly right-adjacent podcasters. Left-leaning ones like Cenk Uygur, Mehdi Hassan, Glenn Greenwald, they're, of course, speaking up as well. Now consider the mainstream media. Admittedly, I have not watched every single second of commentary on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, or Fox this past week, nor have I read every column in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So if the following impression is false, I stand ready to apologize. But it certainly does not appear to me to be the case that legacy media commentary is intensely critical of what's about to take place in the Middle East. This is not particularly surprising. In the run-up to the Iraq War, mainstream media institutions were supportive on balance and frequently provided important justifications for the Bush administration. The New York Times was a particularly egregious offender. So here's my bottom line. Disdain independent media all you want. But with the U.S. government once again gearing up to do something really reckless that I believe a silent majority of Americans oppose, well, I'm glad, at least this time around, there is a healthy ecosystem of independent thinkers on the right and left who stand ready to argue against the mainstream bipartisan foreign policy consensus.
Good radar, Robby, as you would perhaps expect. I agree with quite a lot of that. First of all, I would share your compliments toward Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, someone who I have been critical of in lots of ways for all the reasons you would expect in terms of his more orthodox right-wing positions. But I thought that his interrogation of Ted Cruz was really strong and really exposed some of the contradictions in Cruz's position. We don't have time to go through every single thing, but there was a very telling exchange, I thought, where Carlson was pressing Cruz about, well, is Iran really strong and therefore to be feared and we need to take action now, or really weak and that's why we can take action now? And Cruz seemed to be arguing the two things simultaneously. Yes. And that sort of interrogation, I think, is very useful. In terms of independent media, there is, I think, a broader spectrum of views available. I mean, it seems to me that on this question in particular, whether you're watching CNN or you're watching Fox, there's a fairly narrow band of opinion that can be acceptably expressed, and that band of opinion does seem to be broader in some independent channels for sure.
Yes, and it's very sort of narrow is the right word. It's a lot of, I see a lot of commentary. Maybe I've just been watching the news reports that it's about, well, here are the technical capabilities of Israel. Here are the technical capabilities of the U.S. Here's what we expect from Iran. Here's where we think the weapons are. And less big picture, but okay, what happens if we do this? And I've seen so little discussion in more mainstream places of, well, who, let's say we kill Khamenei, who becomes the next leader of Iran? Is it just someone else from the Islamic extremist faction? Probably. Someone else from the military. The idea, and it comes through in that interview, Ted Cruz says, well, the ideal thing would be the people rise up and install a democratic leadership. Sure. I mean, yes, if I could manufacture that out of the ethos, that is what I would want to happen. But what gives you confidence that is going to take place? And Ted Cruz really had no answer for that, and nor does anyone else that we hear from. So some perspective on that would be so helpful with the Iraq example, you know, in our heads from our own recent lifetimes.
Yeah, and the willingness to discuss the fundamentals of this conflict, which the U.S. seems to be on the brink of joining. Israel has nuclear weapons. You know, do we now accept that countries like India or Pakistan can bomb the other because of a putative threat? One thing before we go, Robby, you mentioned about right-leaning podcasters. We do, I believe, have a clip of Theo Vaughn, who's been really interesting on this topic generally, not presenting himself as an expert, but talking about how he sees this. Do we have that clip, guys?
Trying to get us into a war with Iran or not, America, if Israel is trying to. I don't trust the Israel leader at all. I don't believe anything that guy says. And I don't think that our soldiers should have to go and defend stuff that they start.
Yeah, it's a very good clip. And, you know, it's important to remember, so we all credit now Trump's strategy of appearing on that podcast with Joe Rogan and others as part of his broader appeal to Gen Z, to young men, and being successful, winning that demographic for Republicans over Democrats. This is a demographic that does not want to get sent to fight in a foreign war and is going to be totally against this. And Trump should keep in mind that if he goes to war with Iran, he's going against new voters he took in specifically because they like the more non-interventionist standpoint of
exactly. And Vaughn there presenting himself as not an expert but the voice of that kind of constituency, I think, is very important. Up next, a dire warning from former President Obama. The future of American democracy is at risk. Stay with us. Former President Barack Obama issued a warning about the future of American democracy. Obama appeared before a civic group in Hartford, Connecticut, where he said the country is dangerously close to slipping into autocracy. Let's watch.
If you follow regularly what is said by those who are in charge of the federal government right now, there is a weak commitment to what we understood, and not just my generation, at least since World War II, our understanding of how a liberal democracy is supposed to work.
He went on to say this.
It requires them to take that oath seriously. And when that isn't happening, we start drifting into something that is not consistent with American democracy. It is consistent with autocracies. It's consistent with Hungary under Orban.
Obama also took aim at the affluent liberals, saying they would be tested in some way in today's time, unlike during his presidency. Let's watch.
You could still make a lot of money. You could still hang out in, Aspen and Milan and travel and have a house in the Hamptons and still think of yourself as a progressive. We now have a situation in which all of us are going to be tested in some way. And we are going to have to then decide what our commitments are.
Speaking just days after millions of Americans demonstrated against Trump in the nationwide No Kings protests, Obama said this about protecting American institutions.
There also has to be people in government in both parties who say, well, no, you can't do that.
I mean, Barack Obama is filling a familiar role here and kind of, naysaying things going on. He doesn't like it. That's fine. He kind of was evincing a sort of contempt for liberals who go to Aspen, but you're one of them, bro. That's your people you're talking about. I'm sure in response, many conservatives would talk about all the undemocratic, in their mind, things he did. I would point to that there was a consistency in the level of executive orders being issued from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump. Of course, I'm very critical of some of the things Trump is doing now that I think are undemocratic, and I don't want rule by executive order. I want rule by Congress, the way our founders intended. That is not characteristic of governance in the modern era, really. Under Republicans or Democrats, a lot of deference to the executive that I think is unhealthy. But I think Obama's criticism there is a little bit more partisan than mine would be.
Well, I think Obama was right. I think I would entirely endorse what he said there about creeping authoritarianism. I think you look at the instances, some of which we have talked about before, Trump's assault on law firms that represented his enemies, his desire to bring colleges into his control, his firing of inspectors general, his willingness to defy court orders when it comes to people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia and others, his attacks on the media.
Back. We got him back. We brought
we did
citizen, not non-citizen Abrego Garcia back to the U.S.
We did eventually bring him back, not under the basis. I mean, the administration was seeking to deny or obscure the fact that he had been deported illegally, and have now brought him back and are kind of like, well, it's really about him facing these charges. He was deported to El Salvador in contravention of a valid immigration order. The point is that I think that Obama rightly sees Trump as a one in a generation, if not one in a lifetime, danger to those kinds of American values of pluralism and dissent. And I think we just have seen him deploying the National Guard and the Marines in Los Angeles unnecessarily, in my view. So I think Obama's correct in his diagnosis.
Deploying them unnecessarily. Look, I'm a big states' rights guy, as you know, so I don't like to have the feds come in and start, telling local authorities how to run things. I think that has often put me at odds with, frankly, the Obama administration and Democrats, who don't usually feel that way. But don't you agree? I mean, since you brought up the LA riots, I mean, the American people don't want cars set on fire. They don't want the windows of buildings smashed. They don't want rioting in the streets. They want civil protest, fine. Everywhere that the No Kings protests took place, it was healthy dissent that didn't face any kind of government crackdown, nor should it. That is welcome. That we are not an autocracy. You can dissent. Try doing that. Try having those kinds of protests. Forget Hungary. I'm not sure why that was the example presented, but in China or Russia or somewhere like that, North Korea, you can be shot on sight. So we're not an autocracy. You can still dissent. So everywhere those protests took place, it was healthy dissent, and that's good. Except in LA, where there's rioting, not just protesting, but rioting taking place, and rioting is going to invite a police response. Not just because Trump wants that, but because people want that. Whole people, they want rioters locked up and prosecuted. They don't want this. The people in the communities don't want this.
But you just said, rightly, police response. The reason we have law enforcement is because people break the law and need to be apprehended when they do so.
Yes.
The police in Los Angeles were capable of dealing with that situation over a period of days, and it would have faded. Trump instead sought to escalate the situation, sought the confrontation, sought the inflammation caused by the deploying of the Marines and the National Guard.
Yeah, I don't know that I see it that way. I think there was, I think people with the BLM riots in mind didn't want to take a wait and see, let it all burn down and, burn itself out kind of approach to that. Obviously, I don't like the initial government instigation from the point of doing the ICE raids. Is not something I want to do of otherwise law-abiding working people. I want to concentrate on violent criminals, deport them, not just do the Stephen Miller plan. Next up, President Trump has reportedly approved attack plans for Iran, but will he make the move? We will get into that next. U.S. involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict seems to be up in the air for now.
The Wall Street Journal, however, is reporting that President Trump has already approved attack plans for Iran. The Journal writes, President Trump told senior aides late Tuesday that he approved of attack plans for Iran, but was holding off on giving the final order to see if Tehran will abandon its nuclear program. 3 people familiar with the deliberations said.
Here's what President Trump told reporters yesterday.
I have ideas as to what to do, but I haven't made a final. I like to make the final decision 1 second before it's due, because things change. I mean, especially with war, things change.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal expressed concern over whether the U.S. was prepared for such a task. Let's watch.
One point that deeply troubles me is that I have no sense, no confidence that we have adequately prepared U.S. personnel in the region, both civilian and military, for the ramifications of a strike.
Meanwhile, the Middle East conflict rages on. The IDF tweeted a statement from a spokesperson this morning, writing, early this morning, an Iranian ballistic missile directly hit the Soroka hospital in Beersheba. This hospital serves over 1 million Israelis, including Bedouins, Jews, Christians, and Arabs alike. Iran targets civilians. We target an existential threat that endangers global security.
As a result of this attack, Israel's defense minister said that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, cannot continue to exist.
Khamenei rejected Trump's calls for surrender and said that if the U.S. gets involved, they will face, quote, irreparable damage and, quote, all-out war will ensue. Khamenei said Wednesday, wise individuals who know Iran, its people, and its history never speak to this nation with the language of threats because the Iranian nation is not one to surrender. So I will say Trump's mind not being totally made up is better than being firmly, absolutely committed to war and regime change. There is, I think that we're at a moment where there are mixed feelings inside the administration. There are certainly mixed feelings outside the administration. I was just looking, this just came out, I think, as we were doing the show, a poll from the Washington Post on how the American people are feeling about this. You have opposing the war, 45%, unsure, 30%, support is just 25%. Support among Republicans is higher, but it's not universal by any stretch of the imagination. So, and then independents massively oppose it. So the American people have, at best, some skepticism of this. They think it is a dubious proposition. Trump should be listening to that. He should be listening, I hope, to more non-interventionist voices like Tulsi Gabbard, although there's some news about her being sidelined that we're going to get to a little bit later in the show. What do you think's going on?
So, first of all, before we get to the big picture, that poll was really interesting. I just want to pick up on something that we mentioned in the introduction there, which was this Iranian missile hitting the hospital. That's bad. I am against attacks on hospitals. I'm also against Israel's attacks on 36 hospitals in Gaza, which doesn't seem to me to have created the same outrage, at least in the American media, as this instance. And I do not say that to think or to in any way celebrate Iran hitting a hospital. That is a bad thing. Now, in relation to the broader question here, those poll results that you read out were really interesting because that's a very firm plurality. 45% against 25% for, and a significant group in the middle. That, to me, points out the real skepticism among the American public about doing anything that would get the United States sucked into a war here.
It's a much greater level of skepticism than there was among the public initially for Afghanistan or Iraq. Public approval of those was higher and then evaporated when reality set in. So if we're already starting out at a baseline of greater skepticism, and again, I would point out to the existence of an independent media ecosystem that allows for skeptical voices to be expressed as helping to boost those numbers, all a very good thing. This should be something that gives our officials a great deal of pause.
No, absolutely. And to that point about what we were talking about in relation to independent media and the arguments that were being heard there, you made the completely valid point about if the goal here is really to topple the current regime in Iran, who is going to replace the supreme leader if he is removed? If the whole system is going to be removed, how's that going to be replaced? From where is it going to draw any kind of legitimacy? None of these questions are being answered at all. And I think you do see across party lines a skepticism about the US getting potentially sucked into what someone like Steve Bannon would call another endless war, I think. Because what actually is the objective? Is the objective purely to destroy Iran's uranium enrichment capabilities? Well, so then you drop this bunker buster on the one plant that's built inside a mountain and it's all over. It seems unlikely to me that Netanyahu is going to settle for that being all over at that point. And so where does the US go from there?
Right, it's very clear what Israel wants to do.
Right.
We need to discuss what level of support we're giving it. It can't be the policy-making organ for the U.S. military is Congress, not the Israeli government, and frankly, not Trump on his own. I'm sure you agree. It is appalling to me that this war is not being discussed and debated in the halls of Congress and then voted on by our representatives, by our congressmen, by our senators. That is the way it is supposed to work. This is not covered under the anti-terrorism justification or anything else. Iran is a separate, sovereign nation that has not attacked us, so we can't claim it's defensive with the Houthis fired on our ships where it's okay to do some kind of limited attack. No, this is war against a unique country that has not attacked us first. That needs to be undertaken by Congress so that people are on the record as having voted for it and can be held accountable later if it goes badly, as was Hillary Clinton and people in the Republican Party who ended up supporting it. They were on the record. That's the way it's supposed to be done. This is not Trump. I mean, I appreciate that he's thinking it through and listening to other people and is not gung-ho going to necessarily do everything that Israel wants, and he's pushed back on them in other ways, and it's a complicated situation. But it is not his call alone to make.
Right.
It is right. I mean, how do we get around it? It is Congress's role to do this.
No, absolutely. I agree 100% with that. I agree about the importance of holding people accountable for their votes, but also just that it is not up to a president of whichever party to just decide that he will launch wars on a whim or because he has decided. That is something that Congress legitimately has the power to do. Next up, will 24 states follow suit on Tennessee's ban on transgender youth medical care? The latest Supreme Court ruling may make that easier. We'll discuss next. A major blow to transgender rights. The Supreme Court has upheld a Tennessee ban on gender transition care for minors. The ruling will likely have a broad impact on 24 other states who have enacted similar bans.
The law bars gender transition surgery, puberty blockers, and hormone therapy. However, the ruling does not affect states that do not have bans. Vice President J.D. Vance actually took to Blue Sky for the first time to write about the ruling, saying, quote, "I found Justice Thomas's concurrence on medical care for transgender youth quite illuminating. He argues that many of our so-called experts have used bad arguments and substandard science to push experimental therapies on our youth."
Vance was quickly suspended from the platform, but his account was later restored. Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer sounded off on the ruling, writing, "Republicans' cruel crusade against trans kids is all an attempt to divert attention from ripping health care away from millions of Americans. We'll keep fighting and we'll keep marching on."
Right, so this ruling says states that want to prohibit these kinds of treatments for minors can do that. It seems obvious. I mean, I am a libertarian, so I am generally fine with preventing the government from limiting what people choose to do with their own bodies. Now we're talking about minors, and we generally have a broad consensus that government can set rules for what's okay for minors that abrogate their rights or their family's rights. We don't let minors drive cars or vote or in some cases like get tattoos without their parental permission or sex at various levels. There's all kinds of behavior that is said you're not an adult yet, you can't consent to it. These kinds of treatments, I would say, are the medical necessity of and how helpful they are is still being robustly debated and explored. If you look at European science authorities who have explored this question and looked at the evidence, there is not a lot of really compelling data to suggest a lot of great outcomes. Now, there's not a lot of cases overall, so I think we're still figuring out what is the best way to handle underage people who experience gender dysphoria. That is still being worked out. I don't think it is crazy to prohibit it, and if you grant that the state can have some power over what is appropriate for minors, I don't see how you could reach a conclusion other than it is all right for states to do this, and other states cannot do that, and then we'll see what's a better policy. That's just kind of how we arrive at good policy.
Sure. The Supreme Court ruling was getting into a quite complicated distinctions of law, but to get at your point about the research into this, there is a very heated debate about that because a lot of people say, look, gender-affirming care to people in adolescence does in fact reduce suicide risks, improves mental health outcomes, and so on and so forth. Others argue that some of these treatments, are they irreversible, and so do people, as it were, change their mind and come to regret them? But you're right. I mean, there is also a real debate about whether the treatment itself is effective. John Roberts, in his ruling, quoted a study from my beloved National Health Service in Britain, which found that the evidence to support the use of puberty blockers and hormones was, and this is the quote from the NHS study, remarkably weak, and that there was, quote, no good evidence that it did in fact work. Now, obviously, advocates for the trans community vigorously contest that and say that it does. All I'll say is there's a very heated debate about it. Then you come to what the Supreme Court was ruling on, which was interesting because the argument was not exactly trans people are being discriminated against. It was arguing that it was violating gender-based, the equal protection clause as it pertains to gender. And the argument was someone who was born female could use puberty blockers or hormone treatment for other reasons in a way that someone born male who wanted to appear more female could not. Right. And therefore it was discrimination on the base of gender.
It seems like a very creative argument to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle, I think.
Well, especially when it's just, well, that's what the law is.
Right.
I mean, you got to go to your state. I mean, again, if you believe that there should be laws and restrictions on what people should do, then you have to make that case to your legislator, your state legislator, and get a different law that says that would change what the exceptions are. But they structured the law in such a way they are trying to prohibit this treatment from people who are biologically born male to receive treatment to become female or other ways around because of the dubious nature of the scientific research thus far. they are not citing dubious research about if you're born female to take treatments to make you more be able to fully express that for if you have some kind of gender defect. That's fine. Again, that's just how these states decided to do it. And if you concede that it is proper for the government to put any kind of limitations on what underage people are able to do, I don't see how you can say that's not permissible.
Right, and Roberts' argument, which was, you know, a 6-3 majority verdict, was that because the Tennessee law applies to what certain drugs can be medically used for, and on the basis of age, it is not discrimination that runs afoul of equal protection, because it's saying, look, these drugs, you can't have those for minors for this particular purpose. But if someone has a congenital defect, or there's a you know, very early puberty, you can use them for that reason, but not because someone is uneasy in their gender identity.
I think the greater harm that we are trying to prevent would be, I once saw research suggesting that the vast majority of people who expressed some kind of gender dysphoria in their adolescent time period, they end up not receiving any treatment for it. And the vast majority of them desist in feeling not aligned with their birth gender. So if all of them got, now some people don't, and treatment would be good for them. I think this treatment would be good for some people. But if everybody just at the drop of a hat was able to seek some kind of treatment when they're underage, given that most of them will recover from this mental condition without any kind of intervention, you'd be worried you'd be having a lot of unnecessary interventions that would lead to people having regretted doing it later in life. And that's what we're trying to prevent.
Right, and rates of gender dysphoria have absolutely gone exponentially higher. And it's like, if it's a medical or mental health condition, why is that happening?
Raising the possibility of a kind of social contagion sort of thing. Yeah. Pete Hegseth facing the heat in a Senate grilling. We'll fill you in on that coming up next.
Characterization that I would be given or are given unlawful orders. It's all meant to attempt to smear the commander-in-chief, and I won't fall for it.
That was, of course, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in the hot seat Wednesday, where Democratic senators on the Armed Services Committee grilled him on his management of the military, President Trump's handling of nationwide anti-ICE protests, and even his past. Senator Mazie Hirono praised him on whether he'd comply with court orders should the courts rule against Trump's order to mobilize troops within the U.S. Here was his response.
If the court says this deployment of troops into our cities is not legal, would you follow that court's order?
It's pending in the courts, Senator.
Well, when the court decides, would you follow that court's order decision?
I don't believe district courts should be determining national security policy.
Michigan Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin fired off asking Hegseth if he ordered the shooting of unarmed protesters. Take a look.
Have you given the order to be able to shoot at unarmed protesters in any way? I'm just asking the question. Don't laugh. Like the whole country. And by the way, my colleagues across the aisle.
What is that based on? What evidence would you have that an order like that has ever been given?
Giving that order to your predecessor, to a Republican Secretary of Defense, who I give a lot of credit to because he didn't accept the order. He had more guts and balls than you.
Slotkin said she read it in ex-Pentagon Chief Mike Esper's book. Hegseth said this.
Senator, I'd be careful what you read in books and believing it, except for the Bible.
To me, the most controversial part of all of that was Hegseth implying that he would, in fact, ignore a district court order in relation to this deployment of troops on American streets, suggesting that a district court judge would have no power to, shouldn't have the power to make such an order, and that it would be ignored pending it arriving at the Supreme Court. That's not how the system works. If a legal court order is handed down, and the administration should obey that order. If it thinks the order is wrong, of course, it can appeal. The Supreme Court would then, well, if it reaches the Supreme Court, would rule in whatever fashion it wishes.
Yes, this seems to be the new thinking among some on the right, that the only court that really matters is the Supreme Court, and that district courts are getting in the way and can be ignored. I don't really share that way of thinking, obviously.
Glad to hear it, Robby.
So he should just say that he would follow the district court, while disagreeing with it fervently and applying it to the Supreme Court. I will point out that the Trump administration is following and complying with Supreme Court decisions, so it's not an issue with the ultimate authority here, but he should follow the district court rulings as well.
I mean, it is true that it has not so far defied Supreme Court rulings, and thank God for that. But it is true that there are people within the administration, not only Hegseth, who, as you say, are subscribing to this view that orders of lower courts can be sort of ignored until the Supreme Court renders its judgment. That is crazy talk and very, very dangerous, because if you get into a situation where an administration says, well, we're just going to ignore the law until the Supreme Court rules, firstly, the rule of law is unworkable while that process goes on. And secondly, it just puts so much of the timing in the control of when things arrive before the Supreme Court. It puts an incentive for the administration to push it as long as possible before the Supreme Court rules.
As far as the shooting of unarmed protesters goes, it did not sound to me like he was endorsing that, like he was saying that that was ludicrous, the idea that he would give that order, which is a good thing. Unarmed protesters should not be shot, nor so should journalists or independent journalists. I know an independent journalist who was injured by non-lethal rounds in what was going on in L.A. That's always very bad. What the American people want is not confusing. They want rioters and looters and people setting things on fire to be detained and arrested and prosecuted. We vigorously support and defend the right to protest peacefully, to rally, to gather, to speak your mind, to do that kind of thing. That's all fine. It's a very clear dividing line in most cases. The kind of people who are showing up to just protest and the kind of people who are showing up to cause riots and destruction. It's in most cases a pretty easily discernible, definable category difference, and so that's fine. And the police have every right, or the police are the correct authority to take care of that, frankly, in most cases, not the military. There may be some cases where things get so out of hand, the military is called for, and I would say that support for using the military in some cases among the American people is higher than I think many liberal elites would appreciate, as emerged over the controversy. You remember the send in the troops op-ed from Tom Cotton that was so controversial in the New York Times, but then when you polled the question, most people agreed with it. The military should not be the first resort for dealing with unruly protests. I think we agree on that, but it could be used, but I didn't have any problem with his answer there. We should follow and comply with court orders, and they would save themselves a lot of trouble if they just did that. So I hope they follow all court orders, including district court orders.
So I certainly endorse the idea that the police should be the main agency to quell protests or to police protests. I mean, the military that's not the military's job. That is not what the military is trained for. There is, I think, an inherently repressive symbolism, at least, to sending American troops onto the streets to crack down on protesters. I'm not a fan of that. I think it would only ever be permissible if the society itself was literally, melting down.
But you're a big, you've spoken very passionately about how offensive January 6th was to you, and I also think it was very bad what happened. In response to that, it was not just it was the military came. I lived at the time I still live near the Capitol, but I lived in a building that was somewhat near the Capitol, and there was a senator who lives in that building, and there was a tank in the driveway of the building, and there were soldiers on every corner. I mean, was that? I don't think that was. Given what happened, I don't think that was improper at all.
But that's consistent with what I just said, because one of the reasons that January the 6th is so offensive to me was that it was an attempt to overturn an election and therefore an existential threat to American democracy. People setting a car on fire because they don't like ICE raids is not something I approve of, but it doesn't threaten the collapse of American democracy.
See, what offended me about January 6th was the destruction and the smashing and the building trespassing and which I want quelled not by any means necessary, but I want aggressively quelled.
But then let me reverse the logic. So do you think it was right to deploy the Marines and the National Guard in LA because there was vandalism going on?
I'm open-minded about it. I guess I don't have my mind totally made up about it. I think it was called for. I mean, the local authorities even said at the point it's gotten to now, it is called for. They might have been involved too early, and that might have exacerbated the situation. Given the destruction that did occur, I think I support sending them in.
Fair enough. Well, we are going to lighter topics next because we're wondering whether your Starbucks has just got healthier. RFK Jr. says the coffee chain is jumping on the health kick bandwagon. We'll get into that next.
Starbucks is embracing MAHA. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. posting on X Wednesday he met with Starbucks CEO Brian Niccol and saying that the Seattle Coffee Company plans to further MAHA on its menu. Now, while the secretary didn't give any details in his post, Niccol has said that the chain plans to expand health and wellness. Last week, Starbucks said it was testing new drinks that include sugar-free and added protein options.
Starbucks is just the latest food company to announce it will be making changes to its ingredient list. It's just 2 months after Secretary Kennedy announced HHS would move to ban artificial food dyes. Kraft Heinz announced this week that it would eliminate all chemical food dyes over the next 2 years. That includes red number 40 and blue number 1, used in food products like Kool-Aid, Jell-O and Crystal Light. Meantime, General Mills and Sam's Club have jumped on the MAHA train as well. General Mills saying that it will also remove artificial colours from its retail portfolio by the end of 2027, and all synthetic dyes from food served in K-12 schools by next summer. And Walmart is promising most synthetic dyes will be removed from its Sam's Club private labels products by the end of the year.
The scramble for companies to get ahead of HHS's changes doesn't seem to be slowing. Here was Secretary Kennedy on CNN just a few weeks ago.
We're watching companies now that are changing their ingredients because of this movement. You see these big fast food conglomerates that are switching from seed oils to beef tallow fat. You see, and then reducing the ingredients. You see Chobani yogurt changing its ingredients because of the demand that has happened because of the MAHA movement.
The MAHA train seems to have bipartisan support. Democratic Congresswoman Grace Meng applauding Kraft Heinz this week, writing on X, "This is a good step forward and proof that with bipartisanship and common sense, we can deliver results for our families. Let's work together to make sure the foods we feed our kids are healthy."
Look, I think if companies are voluntarily changing their ingredients because the public is more aware of what's in foods and wants more natural foods, and RFK Jr.'s advocacy as a prominent person in public life is responsible for that trajectory, that is all perfectly fine. That's a market mechanism that is good. I too would like our foods to be healthier, full of this. It's kind of a nonpartisan, obvious thing. Everybody wants fewer synthetic products and red dyes or whatever, and if that is being voluntarily adopted, fine by me. I wouldn't make them do it via government fiat. I would also just end silly barriers that stop. I would stop subsidizing corn syrup, and I would end the ban on just importing food products from other places in the world. So then they would have to just make them be the same thing. That's government policies I would do. But yeah, spreading awareness about this is all fine. Starbucks having a sugar-free, I guess they don't have any sugar-free options. I'm a big coffee drinker. But I am not a fancy coffee drinker.
Sure.
I take it black.
I'm with you there.
When I got on my health kick about 2 years ago now, I decided to get more serious about my health. I started working with a personal trainer. I started trying to eat more in healthy ways. I tried to drink less, but that's much harder than eating better and working out more. But the first thing my trainer told me to do is cut. I used to fill my coffee with tons of artificial sweet creamer, actually Starbucks flavored creamer.
There you go.
And I cut that. Now I just drink it black, plain coffee, unfancy black. So yeah, when you have like the really fancy, sugary Starbucks coffee, it does feel like eating a meal, and I feel ill afterwards.
No, it is. I mean, and can be massively calorific as well. I mean,
and massively expensive.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Same cost as a sandwich.
I mean, on occasions when I have tried to be, I try to be reasonably healthy, but when I'm trying to particularly lower the amount of sugar I consume, what I'm often reminded of is just how many products have sugar in them. I mean, to the point where if there is sugar-free bacon, it is billed as such because regular bacon has like sugar, meat with sugar, you know, tasty.
Yeah.
So there's all of that stuff. Look, as far as the Kennedy thing is concerned, this is the element of RFK Jr. that I have no real problem with. The kind of crunchy, organic side. You know, I'm all in favour of avoiding artificial dyes. I'd probably be more willing to use government fiat than you would for that purpose, but I've no problem with this.
I got to explore this whole seed oils topic in greater depth. Seed oils are becoming the great villain of our time.
But debatable, or whether they...
Yeah, I don't know whether that's deserved or not. And I know people will swear that that is the bane of our existence and all of our problems in society stem from seed oils, but I need to do a little bit more of my own research on that topic, because I'm not sure.
Not a seed oil expert, Robby, so let me know what you find out.
I only really have Starbucks if I'm like I'm going to Union Station to take the train to New York, and there's a Starbucks there. Although I think they closed it because because of the homelessness problem in our nation's capital.
I don't know, it was the homelessness problem. They weren't making enough money. You and I had coffee in a Pret in Union Station.
Oh, we did. We did. Yes.
Anyway.
Well, that does it for us on Rising Live today. Please look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way today, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. It'll be me and Niall almost all week next week, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Lots of Niall to come. Isn't that wonderful? Stay tuned. See you later.